Great, thank you. Hello, you can see me, but I can't see all of you as much as I'd like to. My name is Aryn Martin. I'm Associate Dean of Students in the Faculty of Graduate Studies here at York. I hope you've been taking advantage of many panels at Experience Grad, perhaps met the potential program personnel. So where I fit in the whole scheme is as Associate Dean students, I have some kind of relationship, usually behind the scenes, to every York graduate student, master's or PhD, for things like admissions, petitions, sometimes just consultation. But I'm kind of another level of support for students at York beyond your program, which is where you would have the most exchange. I am a professor of sociology here at York, but I have a trajectory that makes my relationship to the topic of diversity in STEM a little more obvious than it might at first seem. My undergrad is in life sciences from Queen's University in Canada. And I liked science and did well enough. But I discovered sort of near the end of my undergrad a field called science and technology studies. So my PhD is actually in a group of an area where we study anthropology, history, sociology, philosophy of science and technology over a long historical period and including in the present. So since I've been in this role, I've really had an ear to the ground and met with many science, technology, so STEM, science, technology, engineering. I don't know, it's math or medicine, but both we'll throw in there. I meet with a lot of students, and I'm also been involved in several initiatives that are geared towards thinking about equity and diversity, specifically in the sciences. So it's kind of a little bit about me as a what am I doing here? Why did I put this on the panel? This topic is new this year. I think it's a super important one, and I'm really glad that you popped into this session. So I'm going to start with the question. So I do a little bit of teaching, a little bit of, I wish it was more conversational near the end. So I'm going to speak for a bit, and then I have a guest who's a neuroscientist named Cheryl Chow. That's a postdoctoral researcher here at York, and she's going to come and speak a little more informally about her personal experiences. And then we'll have time at the end where we can have some Q&A for both Cheryl and I. So I'm going to start by asking you the question, what does a scientist look like? And this, take a second, imagine what this is evocative of in your own mind. Eileen, I have some question slides. I hope you'll see when they're coming up. What does a scientist look like? So to answer this fairly rudimentary question, I started by typing it into Google, how we find out everything. And oh, hi Cheryl, welcome. I'm glad you're here. I've just begun. So I've asked the audience, the people in the room, what does a scientist look like? And invited you to imagine that. So I typed it into Google, sorry, next slide. And got a range of images that are not terribly diverse. None of this you have to study very carefully. I just thought, well, I wonder if this is an adequate representation of what you might ask a large group of people. So generally we have fuzzy hair, white man is pretty entrenched, I think, in terms of an ideal type, and I don't mean ideal as in the right or true, or but a historical archetype that maybe is available. I also found a study published in the journal Science, Eileen, next slide, that asks this question and has some some hopeful information for those of us interested in diversity, that there is some change over time in what the archetype of the scientist looks like. So they have followed an enormous number of children, have them draw pictures over decades. And so we've gone from 1% who drew women to 34% about 5 years ago who drew women. I like this because it shows change, but also because it shows that perhaps 5 years ago, so in the very short article, this is the only change that is mentioned in terms of diversifying. So it's kind of a tiny open in the door if we're only thinking of diversity in terms of men and women. The researchers weren't capturing skin color, whether there's a evidence of a bodily disability, other kinds of markers. So yeah, great, more women. I think in the last 5 years, we have become better at thinking more broadly about diversity to include place of origin, racialization, LGBTQ, trans folks. So not only is it men or women, that's the notion is that there is automatically assumed a binary. So I think this focus on how things are changing, and again, I'm not the perfect person to be talking about this. This is why I've invited Cheryl partly, but I have observed, certainly at the university level, an effort to diversify our incoming student population, including in graduate, to diversify our faculty hires, to think more carefully about the ways in which systemic exclusions have functioned through colonial spaces like the university. So why is diversity in STEM good? That is certainly a premise that I'm arguing, but I'm arguing it for some reasons that might not be, they are kind of obvious, but I'm going to talk about a language that we can use to think about this, that moves it past the individual bodies of people who ought to be included. So the first notion is that, well, it's good because including some, supporting some prototypical historical types of science. Science is very much was a white Western male product from the scientific revolution. Of course, there have always been people we could call scientists, but the fact that there has been gatekeeping, opening those gates isn't for the people that are being included. Of course, it is for them. People who are brilliant and interested in science should have equal access to these spaces and this kind of work and these kinds of good jobs. That's one part, and that's the part we think of most quickly. But my interest is in knowledge, is in what science is able to see and to do. So a little bit of some concepts from my field, science and technology studies. Eileen, can you move along? I have why is diversity in STEM good? Why is diversity good for STEM? So the first reason is sort of a human rights based and perfectly legitimate and important reason, but I'm going to push on that because I think we are too quick to think it's about a them. And I'm saying that from the position of the center. I'm in an institution. I am a white woman. I could also say to you, assuming that there's a diverse audience that have chosen to come to this, but it's not actually, it's about the product of knowledge that is possible when there are more and more people in the room, in the labs, writing papers. So both of these things are super important. So I'm going to talk about this through a concept called standpoint theory. And standpoint theory is quite simple, but I think really profound. That says what we know. It uses perspective as a metaphor. So seeing as akin to knowing, which we do all the time. Oh, I see. So what we know is made possible by where we stand. And that although science has a history of removing the notion that there are specific individual knowers that are situated and standing in a particular place. History of science tells us that is not the case at all. People cannot escape, because we're human, we can't escape the place where we stand and therefore the perspective that we're seeing from. So slide. I found this fantastic comic that I highly recommend. I'll give you the citation in a future slide if it's something, if the kind of thing I'm talking about interests you. So the comic writer who's also trained in science and technology studies is named Sophie Wang. And this is her representation of the notion of perspective, of situated knowledge, and of the impossibility of removing ourselves from where we stand. So we know that scientists have always brought their bodies, their concerns, and their priorities into the work that they do. For example, race science and eugenics were products of colonial science and of particular interested parties that were participating in the best science of the time. And which isn't sort of, so yes, there's every reason for accountability, but my reason for using this example is to show that that this wasn't necessarily, so it's a product of racist people working through science's methods, which cannot divorce, as much as we would like them to, the aims and interests of the workers. So historians of science show us time and again how human bias makes its way into the very content of science. So when I say there are, at least two reasons why I think diversity is good for STEM at York and elsewhere, are getting more people in is right for those people, but also that it will move us towards a better objectivity. So that was sort of a switch there, right? I'm like, it's always biased, and we move to something better and more full. So that's the next slide demonstrates this notion of standpoint theory, which says we know as what we can know is a product of what we can see. It also has the premise that knowledge isn't held by individual knowers, but by a collective. So we know, you've done enough science to know that, I'm sure by virtue of being here and interested in grad school, that there's this collection, this citational practice. There's labs that are communities, that are within larger communities. That's maybe your field of molecular biology, that are within larger communities. That the knowledge is not a product held by an individual, but by a group. That the more similar the perspective of the people forming this group, the more narrow, partial, not untrue or necessarily, sometimes, not untrue or unuseful, but partial and narrow, is the knowledge that can be attained by that group. And should we diversify in all kinds of ways, including racialization, background, class, along sexual and gender orientation, and men and women, of course, the more we can know as a collective. So this is a really important movement, I think, in making a grounding for there have been pushes to get more women in STEM, maybe more, definitely more Black folks and Indigenous knowers in science, technology, engineering, and math across the board. The recognition that numbers are smaller than in the population at large, in the population in which our institutions sit. The question of why is that, and the push for changing that. This is an old kind of question, but I'm putting a newer spin on it, that says the focus isn't on the people necessarily, but it's on the structure, the container. The thing that is science, as wonderful as it is, can and will move. Its capacities will move and grow and be better, the more broad the population of people working in science. And of course, we can think of this in terms of all sorts of difference. So that's just a little taster of thinking about objectivity in relation to diversity. And moving towards this notion, by the way, it's Sandra Harding is the originator of the idea of what's called strong objectivity, and Sophie Wang is the cartoonist who has brought it to us so well. So I'm going to move to talk a bit about York. You're here, I presume, to learn more about the Faculty of Graduate Studies, about the programs at York, and to consider the possibility of joining us. So what is York like in terms of diversity? The first to say our data at the moment isn't great, but noting that as a problem is driving a lot of efforts to improve our data so we can track how this kind of thing changes over time. A university-wide study of all students, including undergrad and grad, is underway right now. We do know that 2/3 of York undergrads identify as non-white or racialized. So in terms of that category, that idea, that identity axis, York has a tremendously diverse undergraduate population. We're located in a tremendously diverse city of Toronto. And the graduate population also has lots of different sorts of people from different life experiences. If I had to guess, we would see, as many studies have seen, that some folks who are typically marginalized in broader society become smaller numerically as you go from master's to PhD to postdoc to assistant professor to associate professor. Again, asking why is that? It's a complex question. We've talked a little bit about it. So I would be lying to say that the faculty complement is anywhere near the undergraduate student population, but it has become a distinct priority in hiring across the board at York in quite recent years. So I'm talking this year and last year. Things are changing. They need to change faster so that we can have role models and we can have stronger objectivity. But I want to say that we strongly encourage your application and your identifying yourself if you wish, if this is true for you, as someone perhaps who hasn't had a kind of typical mainstream background and pathway to science. York has, again, not alone, like other institutions, also invested in some thoughtful long-term strategizing, vision making around particularly excluded groups. And so we have quite recently, sorry, I don't have the names exactly at my fingertips. Eileen, can you move to the, I know the idea of them. They're frameworks around Black excellence and around improving Indigenous recruitment, retention, supports that are specific and accurately serve the needs of community. So we've been working to think across the institution about diversity. Of course, this encapsulates also the science faculties that you might be considering entering. And several new scholarships exist that are really trying to change the population of students, grow diversity in STEM disciplines at York. And therefore, the piece I've added through my argument is change what it is. So I don't think programs will succeed long if they have quite rigid boundaries around what kinds of questions and cares and passions incoming students, master's, postdoc, master's, doctoral, and so on, bring to their research. That will also, I think, change and broaden as a factor as we change and broaden the population. So we're starting to get the hang of naming difference instead of obscuring it. Some people who have studied gender in science over decades, or racialization in science, have noticed that one of the strategies that people who do kind of come in and make it and survive is assimilative. So is sort of being good at seeing what the local culture is and doing their best to be a part of that by becoming maybe less of their full self. This is not my recommendation. That's not my advice from the Associate Dean of Students. I'm saying bring your full self to your application materials, to your scientific work, to conversations that you have, because we need that, because we will be better for it. So I'm gonna, that's about all I was planning to say. Some really practical advice. So starting with your application, if you're planning to apply to York, it does not currently ask you to self-identify by your social location in any number of historically marginalized groups. That's likely to change. Indigenous students are asked and invited to self-identify, but because it's not in the application, I recommend that in your personal statement or supplementary information form, or in an email to your graduate program director, you might gesture to your uniqueness. So of course, your shininess as researchers, your brilliance as scientists and thinkers will be encapsulated in your application materials, but also diversity is a good across the university. We are looking for you. Supervisors need you as much as you perhaps imagine needing them. If you're here, if you're thinking about programs in Lausanne or science, have a look at recruitment and scholarship awards that are geared specifically to traditionally marginalized folks in science. And one last tip, which would really be true for not just STEM disciplines, but across the board for burgeoning graduate students, whether you come to York or elsewhere, is to really spend time finding your people. So what do I mean by that? I mean, graduate school can be lonely, can also be really exciting, and you can build really great community. But knowing early on that it's not just about the books, the sort of studying, performing in a really narrow sense of expectations, but broadening your community that could include, like what I don't know if this is a term but like-bodied is the way I was thinking of it. People who share a gender, country of origin, perhaps a disability. If opportunities exist to find people who feel like kin, then that has been shown through studies to improve happiness, retention, mental health. But not only that, you can also find like-minded people, might have different life experiences or identities than your own, but maybe working through the same kinds of worries or excitements that you are, and that collectivity can really make graduate school a fruitful experience for you. There are kind of unwritten rule. There's the written rules and unwritten rules, or invisible curriculum of graduate school. It's a little bit different than undergrad, and the best place to find out how does it work in this lab, how does it work in this program, is to speak to people who have been there already. So people, a year or two ahead of you, or the next degree up. Don't be shy to ask questions, to explicitly make that kind of cultural capital known. There are lots of lovely STEM faculty at York. I work with many of them, lots of really great graduate program directors. As you are considering where to place yourself and give your gifts, really think about the kinds of people that you find kind, flexible, that you can bring your full self to, and that you're going to be able to do research that you're excited about. As I said, that even though the power dynamics sometimes make particularly STEM disciplines seem hierarchical, the fact of the larger enterprise of graduate school is that we, faculty members, need graduate students to come and enliven our own research interests and to work with us. And finally, find people who make you feel smart. So that's kind of the little bit about some theoretical ideas about diversity in science and its importance, a little bit of practical advice. And I'm going to turn the floor over now to Dr. Cheryl Dr. Cheryl Chow. That was a slip from a singer. Sorry about that, Cheryl. Cheryl's a senior postdoctoral fellow here in the Faculty of Health at York and in Neuroscience. And she's going to share a little bit about her personal experience coming through science grad school.
Thanks, Aryn. And don't worry, actually, you're not the first one, and you probably won't be the last. When they see my name, Cheryl Crow is usually what comes to people's minds. So are you able to see my slide? Just want to make sure. Everything good?
Yep, we can see it.
Awesome. Okay, thanks. So welcome. So today I'm going to basically give a little bit more informal. I want to share kind of my journey to become a neuroscientist. As Aryn has mentioned, I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at York. So let me give you a little bit of background about myself. So I actually was born in Hong Kong and immigrated to Canada with my parents when I was 12 years old. I'm very close with my family. I have a brother who is 12 and a half years younger than me. I would say that I'm bicultural. I identify myself as both Chinese and Canadian. I feel that my cultural background, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, has definitely shaped me into the person I am today. I think as the first child, my dad always had very high expectation of me. He always wanted me to be a doctor, and I'll tell you why I quoted that later, a real one anyways, because as you can tell, I didn't end up choosing that as my career. So what did I do? So with the goal of becoming a real doctor, I got into the PreMed program at U of T. I took a lot of bio courses and mostly on sort of the basic and cellular level. It was very interesting. I didn't love it, but I thought, you know, it was interesting that I was able to learn concepts and whatnot. I had the opportunity to then take Intro to Psych, and that's where I kind of immediately fell in love with the materials. It was very engaging and stimulated my interest in how our minds work. So I became taking more and more psych courses. So, and then I actually graduated with both a major in human biology and psychology. So fast forward a few years, okay, graduated with a double major, and then I asked myself, now what? Unlike some of my peers at the time, they were very sort of sure that they wanted to go into med school, they wanted to go to grad school right away. I thought of becoming a pediatrician because that's sort of what's expected of me to become a real doctor. But then I also felt like I wasn't ready to sort of commit to sort of another 4 years of medical school. But I wanted to leave things open. I was like, do I want to be a pediatrician, or do I want to be a scientist, psychologist, biologist, a teacher? So then I decided to take some time off to travel. So I decided to travel to somewhere hot. And so I went to Los Angeles, and this trip was supposed to be for just a few months. I took a break and just, you know, just to see how things go. But I really fell in love with sort of the culture, the people, the food, the weather, especially. So then I decided to stay there. Then I was like, you know what, maybe I will just sort of take a gap year and really decide what I want to do. So gap year, what did I do? I actually ended up doing an office job as a 9 to 5. I still did a lot of traveling, a lot, on the weekends, along the Pacific Coast Highway and things in California. But that didn't actually last long because this 9 to 5 office job type of thing, which just wasn't very intellectually stimulating. In fact, what I was doing is I was in the back office processing credit cards. It's called merchant services. So basically, when you go into the store, you swipe the card, there's actually someone in the back end sort of processing paperwork. Very boring. But it's great if that's for you, but definitely not intellectually stimulating for me at all. And 2 months in, it's just time for me I was just like, I think it was great. But I needed to really explore my options for my future. So I then sort of look into different programs, grad program, medical school, and I also, using that time to also did my MCAT as well. So MCAT, grad school. So what I finally decided at that time is that I wasn't quite sure whether or not being a pediatrician was for me. I know there were certain aspects that I liked about being a pediatrician, but I still wasn't 100% sure that that's what I wanted to do. So then I decided to pursue a Master's of Science degree in biology in sort of a state-funded school, very different than U of T. And in the first few months, I was able to actually rotate in different labs before I get to settle on one. So I was first in cognitive neuroscience lab, and then I was also then transferred into more of the basic science lab. And then I finally decided that I wanted to do what's called translational science. So I'll be looking at cells and proteins of the spinal cord of a rodent model, and basically process the data and try to understand whether or not how it could relate to sort of human health, that type of thing. So very, very interesting. Through my master's, I also discovered my passion in teaching, and I love being able to share my knowledge and with students, and especially when it comes to sharing the coolest research out there. I decided to continue to stay on at Cal State LA to teach, and was also promoted to be a teaching lab coordinator. I also then decided to teach at different community colleges as well, being an adjunct faculty member. And that experience is very good because I was able to teach in underprivileged communities, and these are students that wasn't able to afford a formal education, so they were forced to sort of work. They go out in the workforce early, and this is sort of their second chance to come back to earn a degree. And most of them work really, really hard because they'll have full-time jobs, and then they would just kind of do anatomy and physiology and all these hard courses after hours. And so teaching was my passion, found it, which was great. And a few years has passed, things are going really great. But something was missing. And I think part of it is because as I got older, I was missing home. Now, parents are, I guess, just less annoying. But professionally, though, I felt like I was also doing well, but needed to do something more. I think I kind of missed the research piece that I wasn't able to do. So then the quest then began to see sort of what my next steps are, started again. Going back to drawing board and look into programs. And at that point, I just know that probably medical school is just not for me, but I was still very interested in working with children, learning more about the nervous system. And most importantly, I know that I wanted to be able to make a difference. So as much as I loved LA and the weather, and Toronto is always going to be my home, so I decided to move back. And so I applied for a few places back in Canada. And I settled on sort of one program at McMaster, it's a PhD in neuroscience. So given my interest in children, I was able to join the Child Emotion Lab by a well-known psychologist there. So they were able to sort of foster my passion in teaching and doing clinical research in children. So kind of allow me to develop a research program that kind of looked at how to reduce anxiety in children undergoing surgery. So then all of a sudden it was like there was an epiphany, because I knew that I always wanted to work with children. I knew that I wanted to do something meaningful. So it all of a sudden, it just kind of, everything kind of just came into place, although it wasn't really planned out that way, because when I originally got into this program, I wasn't even sure that I was able to work with children. And then fast forward, so this is the program that I just told you about. It's basically developing like a tablet-based intervention to help preoperative anxiety, which is anxiety for children undergoing surgery. And what's more important is that I was able to bring neuroscience into the operating room. Before I came into the picture, a lot of the research that are done in the operating room are very, how should I say, it's either behaviorally coded or just more basic type of research, but they have not been able to look at the physiological component of it. So sort of allowing me to bring my expertise into this very, very novel setting. Then you're like, okay, so what does that have to do with York? So what that did was that my neuroscience research, I guess, in the operating room led me to collaborate on a project with York professor, Dr. Rebecca Pillai-Rydell. She's actually interested in bringing neuroscience in sort of the NICU, which is the sort of the neonatal intensive care unit at Mount Sinai. So learning that I have this interest in sort of doing neuroscience research, but in the clinical setting, I'm very fortunate that Dr. Rebecca Pillai-Rydell has actually allowed me to be a co-applicant on this multi-million grant at York. And because of that collaboration, I started to work closely with her, and subsequently she became my mentor, a role model, and now she has actually became my, formally my supervisor here. So this is sort of my experience, and my talk, that's just half my talk, because just to talk about my experiences. But the idea is that, sorry, I guess I'll if you look at my research experiences or academic experiences, it's like, okay, these are the things that I have achieved. But what I really wanted to talk about is actually a lot of things that I haven't achieved, or a lot of rejections to different programs, or a lot of rejections from different sort of things that I've applied to, scholarships and things that really people don't talk to, because that's not something that they will put on their CV. So what I have learned, especially as you can tell, I didn't take the linear pathway like everyone else, where you just kind of go from one to the other. I took some years in between to really figure out what I want to do. In hindsight, I would have loved to take a little less short. I guess I would have preferred to figure out sooner, but that's also because I feel like there isn't a lot of sort of people in my life that could support me in terms of these type of decisions. But as I get sort of into the stage where I've been grad programs, and like everyone's saying in the postdoc, having a lab, having that community is so important, because they actually serve as a very good support to actually give you feedback and to allow you to really say, what, is this something that you want to do? Is this something that's good? It's really, really helpful. And what I also learned is that I learned to ignore when people tell me to don't bother. I've had a lot of people told me, don't bother to apply to this grad school because it's so hard to get in. Don't bother to apply for this scholarship because you'll never get it. Don't bother to submit a paper to this journal because they only take certain things. And in fact, this is actually something that my former supervisor used to joke about, because there's this journal that, I was like, let me try it. And then he's like, okay, you're just going to get a rejection. But I'm like, I'll be okay. And in fact, I didn't, and actually got published in a special edition. And again, just don't know until you try. So I think that ignoring those don't bothers, or just taking the rejections and failures to basically see them as more like key to success, more like that's part of the journey. And also be very, very persistent. If there's something that you want, or that you are interested in, or that it's even mildly, you're like, you know what, I'm not sure if I want to do this, then do it, because that's probably the only way that you figure out whether or not you would, it's suitable for you. Just like I work a lot of odd jobs, my office job, I haven't talked about other odd jobs, just like how I fell in love with teaching, but I wouldn't have known if I didn't do them. But most importantly is to make this your journey. Grad school is long, but you can make it your journey. You can make it enjoyable. And I feel that York has been, just as a postdoc, been very, very supportive and have a lot of resources to support me as a postdoctoral researcher here. So I think that whatever you choose, make it your journey. And I think that's all that I'm going to talk about, and I will open the floors for questions. Thank you all for your time.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. That was great, and a good, I think, fit together with the items I spoke about. I'm wondering if anyone who's here visiting our panel, any prospective students have questions for us. I think you typed them into the Q&A, is that right?
Yep, that's correct.
I had a funding question that I fielded. Any other? It's okay to ask specific questions if they aren't related to the panel, or your thoughts actually, or prior experiences navigating possibly diverse. What do we mean by that? We're all figuring out as we go along, but why you thought to come to this panel and what sorts of things you care about. All right. Okay. So I'm going to use the time then just to ask a broader question. Are you going to other panels, and have they been good experiences at Experience Grad? Eileen, whose voice you sometimes hear, has been the wizard of this venture. And things are unrolling or rolling out as we go along. I wanted to draw attention to Dean Thomas Lobel, who I work closely with, is doing a session tomorrow. I can't remember the exact time, on writing your program statement. So as you're applying to programs, that's a really unique and important, possibly the most important document. So having a sense, noon tomorrow, you can chime in. He's an English professor, but I'm sure some of his advice will be across the board useful. But yeah, knowing the genre of that letter is a really important kind of way to represent that you're ready for graduate school, that you have an independent sense of what kinds of projects you'd be interested and capable of working on. Don't be, I'm just going to fill the time. I don't know if Cheryl wants to fill the time. We're not seeing questions. So thinking of again, advice for the situation we presume you're in, which is just finishing undergrad or maybe just finishing a master's. Don't feel that you can't reach out to people outside of the formal application process. So you can send emails, you can have Zoom. Used to be able to have coffee. That's not as easy. Maybe going to get better in the winter term when we're going back to campus. If you are an international student, I really recommend getting information early and often from York International, which does service both graduate and undergraduate students for some things that come up like visas. Apply for your visas early, things like that. Here's a question. What's your top recommendation for graduate students belonging to an equity-seeking group? Alvin, by the way, Dr. Bell is in the audience as a faculty member here at York. Cheryl, I'm going to move that one to you.
What is top recommendation for graduate students? I would think that just, I think you have touched upon it about kind of talking to different people, and we sometimes say, networking, but I think that that's more like a formal way of just saying, just reach out and talk to many different people. It could be grad students, postdoc, and things like that, and just really learning about, how like belong, like how you were saying that it's like finding a group, right? Finding the group that fits you. If that's sort of answer the questions. I think sometimes it'll take time, even for myself. I feel like just because you are, I feel like it could be my ethnicity, or it could be my, my research. It depends on, there's like different groups that you just have to kind of talk to people and then kind of learn more. And yeah.
And I would say it's not you, it's them. If you're having negative experiences or feeling isolated, which can happen to any graduate student, but is likely more frequent if you feel like you're not part of a mainstream, that you're not fitting in. I'm not saying that that's what you should expect, but I'm saying that there is some good research about, and I've heard from students certainly who feel like that. And, that can perhaps initiate a spiral of self-doubt or worry about something lacking. And so I want to strongly say that something lacking is a product perhaps of the institutional formations that carry with them assumptions about what excellence is, what goodness looks like. And that, again, here I'm going to say, reach out laterally, talk to your graduate program director, find supports for ways, perhaps there's, a graduate wellness center in Faculty of Graduate Studies. Find people maybe who are in a different discipline, but like-bodied, as I called it, that maybe can help you find ways to formulate within a framework that you feel comfortable and safe, what isn't working, why you are experiencing this to be not working, rather than maybe turtling or silencing. And maybe you'll have a fantastic supportive experience. I just feel that it's really important to not sort of sweep what we know about diversity under the rug.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that in the past, like I probably mentioned to you before, that there will be undergraduate students that would even come through my door and say, I don't think I'm going to apply for grad school, or I don't think I'm going to apply for med school because I'm just not, just not enough, or, my GPA is not enough, my this is not enough, right? But it's having a person even just believing in them and and say, look, objectively, this is what I see. I know that's not how you feel, but you are just as good, if not, you're probably better than other candidates. And having that sort of that person, or that supportive person, is so important. But it takes time, they don't I think, but again, talking to someone and making sure that building that trust and connection, I think that's very important too. Yeah.
There's a question from Franklin. Any suggestions for explaining how I can be a good PhD student in the statement of interest, even though I don't have much research experience in the lab? I think one thing is to contextualize there's always do I draw attention to the things that they might be expecting and I lack? or do I not draw attention to it? But I would say an undergrad to a grad, so undergrad to master's, it's not necessarily expected. Some would have experience in a lab, but it's the product of your undergrad experience. Maybe from a master's to a PhD, it would be more likely. But again, describe the context of the program that you are coming from, why you didn't, maybe it's a course-based program or so on, and then focus on your potential.
And I wanted to share that actually, if you look at even before I went into my master's, I didn't have a lot of formal research experiences. I mean, I did volunteer in a lab at U of T, but that's not really, formally, I didn't get like a whole lot of training and things like that. But when I wrote my semi-interest, that it's like what you see yourself and why do you think you're a good scientist and what's your passion too, that's important, and what type of research that you can see yourself doing, and bringing other experiences. It could be work experiences, volunteer experiences, and things that could make up for the lack of the research experience, right? So I think those are just as important. Obviously, like Aryn's saying, you might not want to draw too much attention, but like you said, if that's something that's expected in the lab, for example, in neuroscience, they would expect, going from a master's to a PhD, they would expect certain sort of a level of research skills, but you could probably, you'll have to justify why it would still make you a good candidate, even though you don't have that much experience, because you can always learn. And hopefully you're, but hopefully some of your diverse experience will help to help you to become a good researcher. That's key.
We'll sign off really soon. Something I didn't, I spoke about diversity, but with, it's all in the specifics. And there are so many ways that manifest in your own life, and a lot of them are intersecting as well. But I think that having a gap in your CV because you have children, explain that. Like that it isn't, there used to be, I think 10, 20 years ago, a culture of like, it's bad to have a personal life. And I think, God, I hope that isn't something that you need to worry about. So if there are, gaps or reasons that you don't have a lab experience that have to do with your own life trajectory, then it's fair game to name them. So, or disabilities as well. People are going to be at whatever level of comfort they are with disclosing, but we are working very hard to make it okay to talk about different ways of getting to fantastic work. So, thank you for coming. You can find me certainly, possibly Cheryl.
I can share my email too.
Yeah. If you have any further questions that you want to ask, and I hope you take advantage of other sessions at Experience Grad, and I hope you come to York. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks again, Cheryl.
Thank you.